So as part of what I do for what my clients at Mustad Marine is to provide them the opportunity to get a fluid sample for their machinery, whether it's oil, coolant, or transmission, it doesn't matter. And I suggest this becomes a regular routine, a maintenance regimen for their machinery, and they should do it once a year or so. If you have a sail drive, I would certainly recommend doing it once a year, but it kind of depends on how many hours you put on the machinery, but no more than 2 years. And the most important thing about getting fluid samples on a regular basis is, one, using the same brand and grade of fluid. Don't change, use the same brand and grade for the life of the machinery. And the second thing is to use the same lab, so that way you get consistent results, and more importantly, you get trend lines. So you get trend graphs on your report for the particular fluid or machinery that gives you an idea of its health and where it's going. This can be extremely beneficial to a boat owner because you certainly want to nip this stuff in the bud if you see something going south on you, and you want to see it early. And fluid samples can do that. It's like getting a blood test. All right, before we do anything, I'm just going to do some vitals on the engine. So one of them is going to be blow-by pressure. So I've got this is the crankcase vent hose here going to my manometer, and we're going to fire up the engine and get a cold reading for crankcase pressure. And then maybe we'll warm it up and see what the difference is. Anyway, just trying to get a baseline engine blow-by pressure to see what it looks like before we do the head job, and then compare it to what it looks like afterwards. Okay, we're going to rev up to 1500 now. Fairly steady flow. I don't see any more new sheen there, no more oil. A little bit visible right over here mainly. Engine doesn't sound too bad, but there's a noticeable tick at the lower RPM for the engine. All right, so Mustad Marine Yacht Services was supposed to do this big job during the wintertime. This is a Nautica 35 and has a Volvo engine, and it was running roughly. A lift pump was bad for the fuel pump, which caused some problems with the engine dying out. They also took it to, the owner took it to Helmet Marine. And Helmet did a compression leak down test on the 3 cylinders, and they found out that number 2 was significantly below 1 and 3. So there's a problem with number 2 cylinder. And they suggested a top end job, and that's what we were supposed to be doing. So the owner contracted me to pull the head, take it to a machine shop, rebuild the turbo at a machine shop, rebuild the 3 fuel injectors at a machine shop. To replace the starter, which necessitates taking out this battery box. Replace the water pump, freshwater pump, and the impeller pump. Replace the Raycor unit that's over here. Replace the riser, heat exchanger. Not heat, but the exhaust elbow, and then do a service on the heat exchanger. Clean and paint the engine nice green like it is. Do oil, of course, and coolant, of course. New belts, new filters everywhere. And we were going to replace the thermostat and other stuff like doing a freshwater flush, by tapping into that pipe and giving him access to a T there, so he can plug in a hose and do a freshwater flush on his engine after using it, which I always recommend doing. So anyway, that was going to be, depending on the shape of the turbo, thousands of bucks worth of work. And problem is that number 2 cylinder may not just be a valve like Helmut suggested. What Helmut or the technician over at Helmut didn't see or didn't realize is that there's been a couple of oil sample reports on this engine. And those oil samples both point to high chromium and to a certain extent high fuel dilution or oil dilution. So those two things combined lead me to believe that we have a piston ring problem with number 2. So if that's the case, we have a lower end problem, not a top end problem. So for us to do all this work, do the top end and all the other bits and pieces, and putting it all back together again just to find out that the problem is actually in the lower end would be a significant mistake, a costly one, because then you'd have to repower to do the lower end. And then everything that we did on top, except for replacement of those parts, is all for naught. So I don't want to do that if it means that we still have a lower end problem, because my job is to, assist my customers, not just to do work. So we talked about it, and I just did an oil sample test again. It'll be the third one in 2 years. And we're going to send that off to Polaris Labs and get a new test. And we'll see from the results whether or not it is viable to go ahead and do a top end on this thing. Right now, I don't think it is because of the high chromium. Chromium is one of those metals that you do not want to see in an oil report because it indicates only bad things. Chromium should be 0 to 1 parts per million in an oil sample. All right, so when doing an oil sample, the important thing is you want to get the oil spun up, warm, so it's all mixed up. And then you want to get a sample off the top. All the oil I need for this is right about here. So we're going to send that off to Polaris Labs and get a test back on the oil. And then from that we'll make a decision about what we're going to do with this engine. So here are the oil samples for the Nauticat 35. And this one here was taken, I think at the time of purchase, back in September of 21. That's a sample time. And this had a very high chromium rate here. So this is the chromium, 23 parts per million, and that flagged. And also has high iron content as well, 42 parts per million. Both of those tend to run together. Also, aluminum might be high depending on the type of wear model that it is. But chromium is something you don't want to see in your oil sample. It really has no business being there. Sometimes a coolant can signal chromium. So if your coolant has sodium chloride in it, then that might lead to a high chromium count in your oil if you have a coolant leak. But in this case, we don't see any glycol or any other evidence of a coolant leak. So this looks like wear metal, and since the only cylinder that we see a problem with is number 2, most likely this high chromium is very specific to the number 2 cylinder. So not only are we getting wear, but we're getting very specific wear in a specific cylinder. And who knows what's causing it? Probably dirt, debris, or something foul in the oil may have gotten into the between the piston and the cylinder wall and caused this stuff to kick off. Who knows? But anyway, that is a bad sign. And that was the first one. The next one that the Helmet did when they did a diagnosis on the engine, mind you that this oil sample was not done in coordination with the compression test or the leak down test. Had it been, had the technician been able to see these tests, then most likely his diagnosis would have been different. Anyway, here's the chromium here, 10 parts per million, and iron's a little bit less. Now, these variances could be just the age of the oil and the amount of use it got prior to and that kind of thing. And this is the test that I did with my client. This is Polaris Labs, as you can see here. And this was taken earlier in December 23. And here again we have high chromium. It flagged about 6 parts per million. So the oil is getting fresher here. This oil only had about 40-50 hours on it. And iron's a little bit there, but it's not flagging. Right, so aluminum is not a problem. So all the other wear metals are looking okay, except this here gets a severity of 3 and indicates most likely piston ring wear. And if that's the case, we're talking about lower end, and it's only a matter of time before the lower end goes on this engine. So this is where an oil sample can really save you lots of bucks. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is an old engine. I do a lot of these oil checks, coolant and so forth, and only 40% of my results come back as 0 or normal. The rest, 60%, come back in severity between 1 and 4. So this is something that shouldn't be discounted. It's a very valuable tool to figure out what your maintenance should be, how often, that kind of thing, how your engine's running, and whether or not you can expect heavy repairs coming down the road.